The Bell in the Fog, a Mr. James story. The manuscript from which this account is drawn came to me in the spring of 1923, among the papers of my late colleague Dr. Tobias Whitmore, formerly reader in ecclesiastical history at King's College, Cambridge. Whitmore had been a methodical man, given to precise annotation and careful filing, yet this particular document bore none of his customary marginalia. Indeed, it appeared to have been thrust hastily between the leaves of a treatise on Norman church architecture, as though he had wished it quickly out of sight. The pages, written in his familiar hand but with an uncharacteristic urgency, bore the title, An Account of Certain Events at Greymere-on-Sea, August 1919. What follows is that account, substantially as Whitmore left it, though I have taken the liberty of dividing his narrative into sections for clarity. The reader will judge for himself whether the events described deserve credence. I knew Whitmore for the better part of 20 years, and found him invariably truthful in matters both great and small. His scholarship was impeccable, his observations precise, and his temperament decidedly rational. He was not a man given to flights of fancy or susceptible to the sort of nervous imaginings that might cloud a lesser mind. Moreover, certain particulars of his story have since been corroborated by parish records, local testimony, and, most unsettling of all, by my own subsequent inquiries into the history of that fog-bound stretch of the Norfolk coast. Whether these corroborations extend to the more extraordinary claims contained herein, I leave to wiser heads than mine to determine. I will say only this, that after reading Whitmore's account, I found myself compelled to visit Greymere-on-Sea in the autumn of 1923, ostensibly to verify certain historical details, but in truth, driven by a curiosity I could not wholly explain. What I discovered there, or rather what I heard on that October night, when the fog rolled in thick from the North Sea, has convinced me that Whitmore's narrative, however incredible it may seem, contains more truth than fiction. I had come to Greymere-on-Sea in the second week of August, 1919, seeking respite after the trials of the preceding years. The Great War had taken its toll upon all of us who remained behind, and I found myself much in need of the sort of quiet, scholarly retreat that only a remote coastal parish could provide. The previous spring had been particularly trying. I had lost my dear friend Carruthers at Passchendaele, received news of young Henderson's death at Messines, and struggled to maintain my lectures while nursing an increasingly melancholic disposition that seemed to deepen with each black-bordered letter that arrived at the college. My physician, Dr. Holroyd, had been most insistent. "You need sea air, Whitmore," he had declared after my latest visit to his consulting rooms. "Clean salt air and distance from all this academic dust and worry. Find yourself a remote parish church, somewhere with a decent Norman doorway or a Saxon crypt, and spend a month doing nothing but antiquarian pottering. The mind needs fallow periods, just as the soil does." His prescription proved remarkably specific. Through a correspondent in Norwich, I learned of St. Bartholomew's Church at Greymere-on-Sea, which boasted not only a fine Norman font carved with maritime scenes, but also possessed what was described as an unusually complete collection of medieval parish documents. The prospect of examining both architectural and textual treasures in peaceful isolation struck me as precisely what I required. Greymere proved admirably suited to both requirements. Situated on a particularly desolate stretch of the Norfolk coast, some 12 miles from the nearest railway station at Weybourne, it consisted of little more than the ancient church, a small cluster of flint cottages, 3 or 4 larger houses dating from the Georgian period, and the Red Lion Inn where I took lodgings. The village sat upon a low chalk cliff, overlooking a broad expanse of tidal flats that stretched away into the North Sea, perpetually shrouded in the sort of dense, clinging fog for which that coast is notorious. The approach to Greymere by the coastal road provided one with an excellent sense of the place's isolation. For the last 3 miles, one traveled through flat marshland, intersected by drainage ditches and punctuated by the occasional windmill, their sails turning lazily in the constant sea breeze. The village itself appeared quite suddenly, emerging from this desolate landscape, like something conjured from the mist, which indeed it often seemed to be, so frequently was it obscured by fog rolling in from the sea. St. Bartholomew's Church dominated the village from its position at the highest point of the cliff. Built of the local flint with limestone dressing, it presented a massive, almost fortress-like appearance that spoke of centuries of resistance to both Danish raiders and North Sea storms. The tower, dating from the 13th century, rose to a considerable height and was topped by a curious arrangement of battlements that gave it an unexpectedly martial aspect. The body of the church was older still, with Norman work clearly visible in the chancel and south wall. My first week at Greymere passed quietly and productively. The weather was fine, unusually so for that coast, as I was repeatedly assured by the locals, and I was able to spend long hours in the church, examining both the font and the collection of medieval documents that the present incumbent, the Reverend Dr. Ashford, had kindly made available to me. Dr. Ashford proved to be a gentleman of considerable learning and agreeable disposition, a Cambridge man himself who had held the living for some 30 years. His knowledge of the parish history was extensive, and our evening conversations over dinner at the rectory provided a welcome complement to my daytime researches. It was during one such conversation, on my 5th evening in the village, that I first heard mention of the bell that would later assume such significance in my story. We had been discussing the various medieval chantries that had once existed in the church. Dr. Ashford was particularly well informed about the Mortimer chantry, founded in 1347, when our talk turned to the question of why so substantial a church had been built in what was, even in medieval times, a relatively small and isolated community. The answer, said Dr. Ashford, refilling our glasses with an excellent port, lies partly in the fact that Greymere was once a much more important place than it appears today. In the 14th and 15th centuries, it was a significant port, with a considerable trade in wool and grain. The channel was much deeper then, and ships could come right up to the village wharf at high tide. Indeed, I replied. I had not realized. The tidal flats seem so extensive now. Precisely. The great storm of 1571 altered the entire coastline hereabouts. What had been a navigable channel became the mudflats you see today, and Greymere's importance declined accordingly. But there was another factor in the church's grandeur. The Mortimers were not only wealthy merchants but also patrons of a particular maritime tradition. He paused to sip his port, and I sensed there was more to this story. You see, Whitmore, St. Bartholomew's once possessed a bell of unusual size and remarkable tone. It was cast in 1398, during the incumbency of Father Thomas de Grey, and was said to be audible for many miles out to sea. Ship's masters used it as a beacon in fog, and there are records suggesting that its sound could guide vessels safely to harbor even in the densest weather. A maritime fog signal, in effect. Precisely. But according to local tradition, it served another purpose as well. The bell was rung not only to guide living sailors home, but also, here Dr. Ashford's voice took on a slightly different quality, to call the souls of the drowned to their final rest. I found this notion intriguing from both historical and folklore perspectives. A fascinating tradition. Is the bell still in use? Ah, there's the rub, said Dr. Ashford, setting down his glass. The bell was lost in the great storm of 1571, the same tempest that destroyed the harbor. The tower was struck by lightning. The bell fell, and when the storm cleared, Both bell and portions of the tower had vanished into the sea. There's a local belief that it can still be heard on stormy nights, tolling beneath the waves. A legend not uncommon in coastal parishes, I observed. True enough, though I confess there have been occasions. He paused, seemed to reconsider his words, then continued more lightly. Well, no doubt it's merely the sound of the wind in the present bells, or perhaps distant shipping. The mind plays curious tricks in fog and storm. I was about to pursue this intriguing hesitation when our conversation was interrupted by Mrs. Ashford, who appeared to remind her husband of some parochial duty requiring his immediate attention. The moment passed, and we spoke no more of the bell that evening. The weather changed dramatically on my 8th day at Greymere. I woke to find the village entirely enveloped in fog so dense that I could barely make out the church tower from my window at the Red Lion. The transformation was complete and startling. Where the day before I had enjoyed clear views across the marshes and out to sea, now I could perceive nothing beyond a gray, shifting wall of mist that seemed to press against the very windows of the inn. Samuel Gritton, the landlord, showed no surprise at this alteration in the weather. A stout man of perhaps 60 years, with the weathered countenance and deliberate movements of one who had spent his youth at sea. He served my breakfast with his customary efficiency while offering observations on the meteorological change. "Come in thick overnight, it has," he remarked, setting down a plate of excellent kippers. "We'll not see the sun today, nor tomorrow neither, I shouldn't wonder. When the fog settles like this in August, it tends to linger." "Is it common then?" I inquired. "Yesterday was so clear." "Hey, that's the way of it along this coast. Clear one day, thick as treacle the next. The old folks say it brings things with it, sounds and such that you wouldn't hear in clear weather." He paused in his serving, glancing toward the window where the fog pressed against the glass like a living thing. "They say you can hear the Greymere Bell when the fog's at its thickest." This was the second mention I had heard of this mysterious bell, and I confess my curiosity was piqued. Dr. Ashford mentioned something of the sort, a bell lost in the 16th century. Gritton nodded slowly. "That'd be the one. Great bronze thing. It was hung in the old tower. My grandfather's grandfather claimed he heard it ring the night before the Mary Catherine went down, back in '78. He seemed about to say more, then thought better of it, busying himself with clearing away the empty dishes. The Mary Catherine, local fishing boat, went out one morning in fog thick as this, and never came back. Found her 3 days later, broken up on the rocks near Blackney. All hands lost." He paused again, then added, almost reluctantly, "My grandfather always swore the bell tolled for them the night before, tolled long and slow the way it used to for the dead." I found this local folklore fascinating, both as a student of maritime history and as one interested in the persistence of medieval traditions in isolated communities. I pressed Gritton for further details, but he seemed disinclined to elaborate, mumbling something about old wives' tales and withdrawing to the kitchen with obvious relief. The fog persisted throughout the day, so dense that my planned visit to examine certain memorial brasses in the church had to be abandoned. The building was simply invisible from the inn, though it lay not 100 yards distant. Instead, I spent the morning in my room, working on notes from my previous day's research, while the fog pressed against my windows with what seemed almost deliberate persistence. It was perhaps 2 o'clock in the afternoon when I first heard the sound that would haunt me for days to come. I had been transcribing details of a 14th century will, when a deep, resonant tolling seemed to emerge from the very heart of the fog itself. The sound was unlike anything I had previously heard, not the familiar voice of the present church bells, which I had grown accustomed to hearing at regular intervals throughout the week, but something altogether deeper, more mournful, possessing a quality that seemed to penetrate, not merely the ear but the very soul. The tolling continued for perhaps a minute, slow, measured strokes that seemed to count out some terrible liturgy. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, it ceased, leaving behind a silence so profound that I could hear the blood pounding in my ears. I sat motionless at my writing table, pen suspended above the page, straining to catch any repetition of the sound. None came. After several minutes, I rose and went to the window, pressing my face against the cold glass in an attempt to peer through the fog. I could see nothing, not the church, not the nearest cottage, nothing but that gray, shifting wall of mist. When I inquired about the tolling at dinner that evening, both Gritton and his wife professed to have heard nothing unusual. Their denials, however, struck me as somewhat too emphatic, and I noticed that neither would meet my eyes directly when they spoke. This evasiveness only served to deepen my curiosity about the bell and its associated traditions. The fog persisted for 3 more days, during which I found myself increasingly preoccupied with the mystery of the Greymere Bell. My scholarly work proceeded fitfully, as I found my attention constantly wandering to questions about the bell's history, its loss, and the peculiar persistence of local beliefs concerning its continued presence. Ashford, when I pressed him for additional details during our evening conversations, proved surprisingly reticent on the subject, often changing the topic with a deftness that suggested long practice. It was during this period of enforced idleness that I began a systematic examination of the parish records, searching for any additional references to the famous bell. The documents available to me were remarkably complete, thanks to Dr. Ashford's care, and that of his predecessors, stretching back in an unbroken series to the late 13th century. What I discovered in those carefully preserved volumes provided both fascinating historical detail and, I must confess, a growing sense of unease. The earliest reference I found dated to 1398, in the account books of Father Thomas de Grey, which recorded the payment of £12 to one Master John Brazier of Norwich, for casting of a great bell for better guidance of Christian souls both quick and dead. The phrasing struck me as unusual. Most records of bell casting refer simply to the guidance of the living faithful, not explicitly to the dead. Subsequent entries elaborated on this theme. In 1401, Father de Grey recorded that ye great bell hath sounded thrice for ye drowned mariners of ye bark, Saint Anne, and their souls have found rest. Similar entries appeared with disturbing frequency throughout the early 15th century, always following the same pattern. The bell would toll, and shortly thereafter some vessel would be lost at sea, yet the entry would conclude with the notation that the souls of the drowned had found rest through the bell's calling. More unsettling still was an entry from 1423, written in a different hand, presumably Father de Grey's successor, which noted, "Yea, bell doth sound of its own accord when death walketh upon ye waters, and those who heed its calling are gathered unto their eternal reward. But let no man ring it for his own purpose, lest he summon that which he cannot dismiss." I found myself returning to this particular entry repeatedly. The implication seemed clear enough. The bell was believed to toll spontaneously as a warning of maritime disaster, and there was some prohibition against deliberate ringing. Yet what, precisely, might one summon through unauthorized use remained tantalizingly unclear. The records of the 16th century provided additional pieces to the puzzle. Father William Makepeace, who held the living from 1547 to 1573, left particularly detailed accounts of his incumbency, including a vivid description of the great storm of 1571 that had destroyed both harbor and bell. According to Father Makepeace's account, the tempest struck without warning on the night of September 15th, accompanied by thunder such as might herald ye day of judgment, and lightning that turned the fog to sheets of unholy fire. The bell tower was struck at the height of the storm, and when morning came, both the great bell and a substantial portion of the medieval tower had vanished into the churning sea. Father Makepeace noted that the bell had tolled continuously throughout the night of the storm, despite the fact that no human hand could have reached the bell ropes through the wreckage. His final entry on the subject was particularly chilling. Yea, great bell doth sound no more from earthly tower, yet mariners report its voice still calleth from beneath ye waves, and those who hear it are drawn unto their doom. It was on my fourth night of fog that I had my first direct encounter with the phenomenon that had so disturbed the records of centuries past. I had retired early, wearied by a day spent poring over increasingly cryptic entries in the parish registers, when I was awakened by the sound of tolling, not the distant muffled tone I had heard previously, but something far clearer and more immediate. I sat up in bed, fully alert, despite having been deeply asleep moments before. The sound continued, deep, bronze tones that seemed to resonate not merely through the air, but through the very structure of the building itself. The intervals between each toll were perfectly measured, like the counting of some vast, inexorable heartbeat. Rising quickly, I went to the window and pressed my ear against the glass. The tolling continued, each stroke clear and distinct. Yet when I strained my eyes through the fog in the direction of the church, I could see nothing. Indeed, the fog seemed denser than ever, so thick that it appeared to have weight and substance, pressing against the inn like a living presence. The tolling continued for what seemed an eternity, but was probably no more than 10 minutes. Then, as before, it ceased abruptly, leaving behind a silence that felt almost oppressive in its completeness. I remained at the window for some time, waiting for any repetition of the sound, but none came. Eventually, I returned to bed, though sleep proved elusive for the remainder of the night. When I inquired about the tolling at breakfast the following morning, I received the same evasive responses I had encountered previously. Gritton admitted to having heard something in the night, but claimed it was merely the sound of rigging slapping against masts in the harbor. An explanation that struck me as wholly inadequate, given that Greymere no longer possessed anything resembling a working harbor. It was clear that the local people knew far more about the bell than they were prepared to admit to an outsider. However scholarly his credentials, their reticence was understandable from one perspective. No doubt they had learned through experience that such tales were dismissed as rustic superstition by educated visitors. Yet it frustrated my efforts to understand what was clearly a phenomenon of considerable historical and folkloric interest. Determined to pursue the matter more systematically, I resolved to spend the following evening in direct observation. If the bell tolled again, I would attempt to locate its source, and if possible witness whatever phenomena might accompany its ringing. Doctor! Ashford had mentioned that he possessed the keys to the church, and I felt confident that he would permit me access for legitimate research purposes. The following morning brought no relief from the fog, which, if anything, seemed to have grown denser during the night. The air was so thick with moisture that it was almost like breathing liquid, and visibility had diminished to no more than a few yards in any direction. Ashford, when I called upon him at the rectory, seemed unusually subdued, and I noticed that he avoided looking directly toward the church tower when we spoke. I explained my desire to spend the evening in the church, ostensibly to examine certain architectural features by lamplight. Dr. Ashford agreed readily enough, though I detected a certain reluctance in his manner. As he handed me the heavy iron key, he paused and fixed me with a grave look. "Whitmore," he said, "I hope you won't think me superstitious, but I feel I should offer a word of caution. There are traditions associated with this church, particularly during periods of thick fog such as we're experiencing now. If you should hear anything unusual during your vigil, I would advise against investigating too closely. Some phenomena are best observed from a respectful distance." I assured him that I would exercise appropriate caution, though privately I was more intrigued than deterred by his warning. Here, at last, was acknowledgment from an educated man that the local traditions had some basis in observable fact. I spent the day in final preparations, reviewing my notes on the bell's history and gathering the materials I would need for my evening's work: a powerful electric torch, notebooks, pencils, a camera, though I doubted whether photography would be possible in such conditions, and a pocket watch for accurate timing of any phenomena I might observe. As evening approached, the fog seemed to thicken still further, if such a thing were possible. The air had taken on an almost tangible quality, muffling sounds and creating the peculiar acoustic effects that mariners call fog voices, distant sounds that seem to originate from impossible directions, voices that carry further than they should, and strange echoes that repeat long after their sources have fallen silent. I made my way to the church shortly after 8 o'clock, moving cautiously through fog so dense that I had to feel my way along the stone wall that bordered the churchyard. The ancient building materialized gradually from the mist, its massive bulk somehow more imposing in the obscured conditions than it had seemed in clear weather. The tower, in particular, seemed to loom with an almost oppressive presence, its battlemented top invisible in the gray murk above. The interior of the church felt oddly welcoming after the oppressive atmosphere of the fog-bound evening. I lit my lamp and settled myself in a pew near the nave, positioning myself where I would have a clear view of both the tower and the chancel. The silence within the building was profound, so complete that I could hear the faint hissing of my lamp and the soft scratching of my pencil as I made preliminary notes. For nearly 2 hours, nothing occurred beyond the ordinary. I occupied myself with detailed observations of the Norman font, making sketches of the maritime carvings that adorned its sides, ships with square sails, fishermen hauling nets, and what appeared to be figures emerging from stylized waves. The craftsmanship was exquisite, far finer than I had initially realized, and I found myself wondering whether these medieval depictions of the sea might have some connection to the traditions surrounding the lost bell. It was perhaps 10:30 when the first disturbance occurred. I had been examining a particularly intricate carving on the font's south side when I became aware of a change in the acoustics of the church. The silence, which had been absolute, now seemed charged with expectancy, as though the very air were holding its breath. I looked up from my work and listened intently, but could detect nothing beyond the ordinary sounds of an old building settling in the night air. Then I heard it, not the bell itself, but something that seemed to herald its coming, a sound like distant wind, though the night was perfectly still, accompanied by what I can only describe as a subtle shift in the quality of the fog outside. Looking toward the windows, I observed that the grayness beyond the glass had taken on a faintly luminous quality, as though lit from within by some invisible source. The tolling began a few minutes later, but this time I was prepared for it. The sound was definitely coming from above, from the direction of the tower, yet when I directed my torch upward, I could see nothing unusual. The present bells hung motionless in their frame, and no visible mechanism could account for the deep, resonant tones that now filled the church. But it was unmistakably bell sound, and unmistakably from within the building itself. Each toll was perfectly formed, with the characteristic rising attack and long, singing decay that only bronze can produce. Yet beneath this familiar quality lay something else, a harmonic undertone that seemed to speak of vast depths and unimaginable age. I began counting the strokes, marking each one in my notebook, with the precise time according to my pocket watch. The intervals were exactly regular, 30 seconds between each toll, and the sequence continued for exactly 24 strokes, before ceasing as abruptly as it had begun. In the silence that followed, I became aware of another sound, a soft susurration, like wind through dry grass, that seemed to come from outside the building. Rising carefully from my pew, I made my way to the south window and peered out into the fog-shrouded churchyard. What I saw there will remain etched upon my memory until my dying day. The fog had not dispersed, but its character had changed entirely. Where before it had been merely gray and concealing, now it moved with deliberate purpose, swirling and coalescing into forms that suggested, without ever quite revealing, human shapes in motion. These forms seemed to be converging on the church from all directions, moving with the slow, measured pace of a solemn procession. I watched, transfixed, as the fog figures drew closer to the building. They appeared to be following some invisible path, maintaining perfect formation despite the fact that I could perceive no leader or guide. As they approached the south door of the church, the nearest figure paused, and for a moment the fog seemed to solidify just enough to suggest features: the hollow shadows of eyes, the curve of a jaw, the suggestion of garments that might have been worn centuries ago. Then the moment passed, and the fog resumed its formless swirling, but the suggestion of that glimpsed face remained with me, ancient, sorrowful, and unmistakably human, despite its vaporous substance. I remained at the window, watching the strange procession of fog figures, until they had passed from sight around the eastern end of the church. Their movements had been so purposeful, so clearly directed towards some specific destination, that I found myself wondering whether they might be heading toward the cliff edge where, according to Dr. Ashford, the old harbor had once stood. The temptation to follow them was almost overwhelming, yet I recalled the rector's warning about maintaining a respectful distance from unusual phenomena. Moreover, some instinct, call it scholarly caution or simple self-preservation, suggested that this was not a procession meant for the living to join. I was still standing at the window, debating whether to venture outside, when the tolling began again. This time, however, the sound came not from above, but from below, or rather from some impossible direction that seemed to be both below and infinitely distant. The tone was the same deep bronze voice I had heard before, but now it carried with it another quality, the sound of vast depths, as though the bell were ringing from the bottom of some unimaginable chasm. 24 strokes again, perfectly timed, perfectly formed, yet each one seeming to emanate from further away than the last. By the final toll, the sound was so distant that I might have thought I was imagining it, yet it remained clearly audible, as though it were being transmitted directly to my consciousness, rather than through the ordinary mechanisms of hearing. As the last echo faded, I became aware of a new sound. Voices, faint and indistinct, yet unmistakably human. They seemed to be singing, or perhaps chanting, some melody I could not quite make out. The words, if words they were in no language I recognized, yet the rhythm was that of a hymn or psalm, rising and falling with the measured cadences of liturgical music. Moving quickly to the north window, I looked out toward the cliff edge. The fog there had taken on an even more pronounced luminosity, and within its shifting curtains, I could discern movement, the same purposeful processional motion I had observed before, but now accompanied by the ghostly voices that continued their ethereal chanting. The realization came to me with startling clarity. I was witnessing the phenomenon that had given rise to centuries of local legend. The lost bell of Greymere was indeed tolling, but from its resting place beneath the waves, and its voice was calling the souls of the drowned to their eternal rest. The fog figures I had observed were not products of imagination or atmospheric trickery, but the actual spirits of those who had perished in the waters off this coast, drawn by the bell's summons to whatever final destination awaited them. The scholarly part of my mind recoiled from such a conclusion, seeking rational explanations for what I had observed. Yet the evidence of my senses was too compelling to dismiss. I had heard the bell with perfect clarity, observed the fog figures with my own eyes, and witnessed their purposeful movement toward the sea. Whatever the ultimate explanation might be, I was clearly in the presence of phenomena that transcended ordinary experience. The voices continued for perhaps 10 minutes more, gradually growing fainter as their source moved toward the cliff edge, and presumably, the sea beyond. I remained at the window, straining to catch every nuance of the ethereal chanting, until it finally faded to silence. The fog then began to thin slightly, though it remained dense enough to obscure all but the nearest headstones in the churchyard. It was then that I noticed something that filled me with a sudden, inexplicable dread. Among the older graves near the south wall of the church, several of the moss-covered headstones seemed to be glowing with the same faint luminosity I had observed in the fog. The light was subtle, barely perceptible, yet unmistakably present, a cold, phosphorescent gleam that seemed to emanate from within the ancient stones themselves. As I watched, transfixed, the glow began to fade from the most distant stones and intensify on those closer to the church, as though some invisible presence were moving among the graves, touching each memorial in turn. The pattern of illumination crept steadily nearer to the building, and I realized with mounting alarm that it was following the same path the fog figures had taken during their procession. My rational mind urged me to leave the church immediately, to return to the safety of the inn, and abandon this investigation before it led me into genuine danger. Yet scholarly curiosity proved stronger than prudence, and I found myself unable to tear my gaze away from the approaching lights. Whatever was happening here represented a phenomenon of extraordinary rarity, and I felt compelled to observe it to its conclusion. The glow reached the nearest graves just outside the south window where I stood watching. For a moment, the light seemed to pause there, and I had the distinct impression that I was being observed in return, that some intelligence was studying me with the same intensity I was bringing to bear upon it. The sensation was profoundly unsettling, yet I forced myself to remain at the window, determined to see what would happen next. What happened was something for which no amount of scholarly preparation could have equipped me. The glow began to intensify, and within its cold radiance, shapes began to form, not the vague suggestions I had observed in the fog, but clear, detailed figures that seemed to be composed entirely of that spectral light. They stood among the graves like sentinels, their forms unmistakably human, yet possessing a translucent quality that made them appear to exist only partially in the physical world. I found myself looking directly into the face of the nearest figure, and what I saw there nearly caused me to cry out in terror. It was the face of a drowned man, with the unmistakable pallor and sunken features of one who had died in the sea. Yet the eyes, those terrible luminous eyes, were fixed upon me with an expression of such profound sadness and longing that I felt my heart contract with sympathetic anguish. The spectral figures remained visible for perhaps 5 minutes, though time seemed to have lost its normal meaning in the presence of such extraordinary phenomena. They stood motionless among the graves, their forms wavering slightly like heat shimmer, yet maintaining enough solidity to reveal disturbing details of their appearance. All bore the unmistakable marks of death by drowning: the bloated features, the seaweed-tangled hair, the sodden garments of centuries past. Yet there was nothing malevolent in their aspect. Rather, they seemed to radiate a profound melancholy, as though they were souls caught between worlds, neither fully dead nor able to find peace. As I watched, the figures began to move again, resuming their slow procession toward the cliff edge. But this time, the nearest figure, the one whose terrible eyes had met mine, paused and turned back toward the church. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, we regarded each other through the ancient glass of the window, the living scholar and the drowned soul, separated by the fundamental boundary between life and death, yet somehow connected by the shared experience of that extraordinary night. Then the figure raised one translucent hand in what might have been a gesture of warning or farewell, and dissolved back into the surrounding fog. The others followed suit, their forms melting away like morning mist, until nothing remained but the gray curtain of vapor that had shrouded the village for days. The sudden return to ordinary reality was almost more shocking than the supernatural visitation itself. I found myself alone in the ancient church, my lamp casting its familiar circle of yellow light, with only my hastily scribbled notes to prove that the preceding events had been anything more than an extraordinarily vivid dream. Yet the memory of those luminous eyes, filled with centuries of longing and sorrow, remained burned into my consciousness with perfect clarity. I remained in the church for another hour, hoping for some repetition of the phenomena, but the night had returned to normal silence. The fog outside began to thin perceptibly, and by the time I locked the church and made my way back to the inn, the first stars were beginning to show through breaks in the overcast sky. Gritton was waiting for me in the common room, though it was well past midnight. He looked up as I entered, and I saw in his eyes the same knowledge I had observed in Dr. Ashford's manner, the recognition of one who understood exactly what I had witnessed. "You heard it then," he said quietly. It was not a question. "I heard it," I replied, "and saw considerably more besides." He nodded gravely. That's the way of it when the fog's thick and the bell calls. Most folk pretend they don't notice, but there's few in Greymere who haven't seen the drowned walking on nights like this." He paused, studying my face in the lamplight. "The question is, sir, what do you mean to do with the knowledge?" I spent the remainder of that night setting down a complete account of my experiences, working by lamplight in my room. While the events remained fresh in my memory, the fog dispersed entirely before dawn, revealing a clear sky and calm sea that seemed to mock the extraordinary events of the preceding hours. Yet my notes remained, filled with precise observations and careful timing, providing tangible evidence of phenomena that defied conventional explanation. When I emerged for breakfast the following morning, I found that the village had subtly changed. Where before the locals had been politely evasive when questioned about the bell, now they regarded me with a mixture of respect and wariness that suggested I had crossed some invisible threshold. I was no longer merely an outsider studying their church. I was someone who had shared their ancient secret and must be trusted to handle it responsibly. Dr. Ashford called upon me after breakfast, ostensibly to inquire about my architectural observations, but clearly motivated by deeper concerns. We walked together along the cliff path in brilliant morning sunshine that made the previous night's events seem impossibly remote, yet the rector's manner remained grave and troubled. "I trust," he said carefully, "that your evening's research proved instructive." "Indeed," I replied, though I confess the instruction was of a rather different nature than I had anticipated. He stopped walking and turned to face me directly. "Whitmore, I feel I owe you a fuller explanation than I was prepared to offer previously. You see, what you witnessed last night, assuming you witnessed what I believe you did, is not merely local superstition or atmospheric trickery. It is a phenomenon that has been observed and documented by educated men for more than 4 centuries. Documented? Oh yes. My predecessor, Dr. Thornberry, kept detailed records of the bell's manifestations throughout his 40-year incumbency. Before him, Father Makepeace recorded similar observations, and before him, he gestured toward the ancient church. The tradition extends back to the bell's original installation in 1398. Always the same pattern, periods of thick fog, followed by the tolling, followed by the procession of the drowned, and always, those who witness it are changed by the experience. We resumed walking, and Dr. Ashford continued his explanation. The bell, according to his research, had been cast not merely as a navigational aid, but as part of an ancient maritime ritual. a practice that predated Christianity in these coastal regions. The medieval church had adapted and Christianized the tradition, but its fundamental purpose remained unchanged: to provide a final calling for souls lost at sea, enabling them to complete their journey to whatever rest awaited them. The remarkable thing, Dr. Ashford observed, is that the phenomenon persisted even after the physical bell was lost. Whatever force the medieval bell founders had tapped into, it was not dependent upon bronze and oak for its manifestation. The bell's voice continues to sound from beneath the waves, just as Father Makepeace recorded in 1571. I found this explanation both fascinating and deeply unsettling. But why do so few speak of it openly? Surely such a remarkable phenomenon would attract considerable scholarly attention. Dr. Ashford smiled grimly. Would it? Consider your own reaction, Whitmore. You're a Cambridge don, trained in rational thought and scholarly method. If I had described last night's events to you a week ago, without your having witnessed them yourself, what would your response have been? I was forced to concede his point. No amount of testimony, however credible its source, could have prepared me to accept the reality of what I had observed. Only direct experience could overcome the natural skepticism of an educated mind. Moreover, Dr. Ashford continued, there is the question of the bell's purpose. Those who witness the procession invariably report the same impression, that they are observing souls finding peace at last, after centuries of wandering. To interfere with such a process, or to treat it as mere curiosity for the entertainment of scholars, would be inappropriate. I remained at Greymere for 3 more days, during which the weather remained clear and no further manifestations occurred. I spent the time consolidating my notes, making additional sketches of the Norman font, and engaging in long conversations with Dr. Ashford about the theological and historical implications of what I had witnessed. The rector proved remarkably well informed about similar phenomena reported at other coastal parishes. There were, he told me, at least a dozen churches along the Norfolk and Suffolk coasts where lost bells were said to ring from beneath the waves, calling the drowned to their rest. In most cases, the tradition had been dismissed as folklore, but Dr. Ashford's research suggested that many of these reports might have firmer foundations than commonly supposed. The medieval church, he explained, understood things about the relationship between life and death, between the physical and spiritual worlds, that we have largely forgotten. They built their rituals and observances around practical needs, not merely spiritual comfort, but actual assistance for souls in transit between worlds. On my final evening at Greymere, I experienced one last encounter with the mystery that had drawn me so completely into its web. I had been packing my belongings in preparation for my departure the following morning when I became aware of a sound I had not heard since my first days in the village, the normal, everyday ringing of the present church bells, calling the faithful to evensong. Yet as I listened to the familiar bronze voices, I detected beneath their ordinary tones another sound, fainter, deeper, infinitely more ancient. It was the voice of the lost bell, not tolling as it had on that fog-bound night, but singing in harmony with its earthly successors, adding its spectral music to their liturgical celebration. I went to my window and looked out toward the church tower, visible now in the clear evening light. The present bells continued their measured calling, their bronze forms visible in the tower windows as they swung back and forth. Yet the harmonic undertone persisted, audible to anyone who cared to listen for it, the voice of the drowned bell adding its eternal song to the temporal music of its survivors. It was then that I understood the full significance of what I had witnessed. The bell had not been lost in 1571. It had been transformed, translated from the physical world to some other realm where it could better serve its ancient purpose. The great storm had not destroyed it but liberated it, allowing it to fulfill its function without the limitations imposed by bronze and tower, rope and wheel. I left Greymere on a bright morning in late August, carrying with me not only my architectural notes and photographs, but also a profound sense of having glimpsed something far beyond the ordinary scope of human experience. The train journey back to Cambridge provided ample time for reflection on all I had witnessed and learned during my stay in that fog-bound village. As the familiar landscapes of East Anglia rolled past my compartment window, I found myself wrestling with the question that Dr. Ashford had posed. What was I to do with the knowledge I had gained? The scholar in me urged complete disclosure, a full account for the Journal of Ecclesiastical History perhaps, or a paper for the Royal Archaeological Institute. Yet I was increasingly convinced that such academic treatment would serve neither the phenomenon itself nor the scholarly community that might read about it. There was, moreover, the question of responsibility to the people of Greymere, who had guarded their ancient secret with such careful discretion for so many centuries. They had welcomed me into their confidence only after I had proven myself through direct witness of the bell's manifestation. To betray that trust by treating their mystery as mere academic curiosity would be unconscionable. I resolved, therefore, to keep my own counsel regarding the more extraordinary aspects of my Greymere experience. My official report to the journal that had sponsored my research focused entirely upon the Norman font and the medieval parish documents, making no mention of bells, whether lost or found. The account I have set down here was written purely for my own records, with no intention of publication during my lifetime. Yet as the years have passed since that extraordinary August, I have found myself increasingly drawn to investigate similar phenomena at other coastal parishes, always discreetly, always with appropriate respect for local sensibilities. I have sought out those places where ancient bells are said to ring from beneath the waves. My researches have taken me to churches in Cornwall, Wales, and Scotland, and in each case I have found the same pattern: medieval traditions of maritime guidance, tragic losses during great storms, and persistent local beliefs in the continued presence of lost bells. Not all of these investigations have yielded direct encounters with the phenomena themselves. The conditions that allow such manifestations to occur seem to depend upon a complex interaction of weather, season, and perhaps more subtle factors that I do not fully understand. Yet in 3 instances over the past 4 years, I have been privileged to witness again the tolling of drowned bells and the procession of souls they summon. Each experience has deepened my conviction that we live in a world far stranger and more layered than our modern rationalism allows us to acknowledge. The medieval church builders who created places like St. Bartholomew's at Greymere possessed knowledge that we have dismissed as superstition, yet which proves, upon direct investigation, to contain profound truths about the persistence of human consciousness beyond physical death. It was in the autumn of 1922 that I made my final visit to Greymere, drawn back by a curious compulsion I could not entirely explain. I had received a letter from Dr. Ashford informing me of some restoration work being undertaken in the church tower, and something in his phrasing suggested that the project had uncovered matters of more than architectural interest. I arrived to find the village much as I remembered it, though the season was different, late October rather than August, and the quality of light possessed that peculiar intensity that comes with approaching winter. Dr. Ashford met me at the station wagon he had borrowed from a parishioner, his manner combining genuine pleasure at my return with an underlying tension that suggested significant developments since my previous visit. "I'm grateful you could come so quickly," he said, as we drove through the familiar landscape of marsh and meadow. "The restoration has proceeded more smoothly than we anticipated, but it has also revealed complications that require sensitive handling." The complications, as I discovered when we reached the church, were of a nature that no amount of architectural training could have prepared the restoration team to address. While examining the foundations of the medieval tower, the workers had uncovered a chamber that appeared on no existing plans, a small stone-lined room directly beneath the point where the great bell had once hung. "We think it may have been a resonance chamber," Dr. Ashford explained, as we descended into the excavation by means of a temporary wooden ladder, designed to amplify and direct the bell's voice toward the sea. The chamber was indeed small, perhaps 8 feet square, but it had clearly been constructed with great care and considerable knowledge of acoustic principles. The walls were lined with dressed stone, and the ceiling curved in a complex pattern that would have focused sound waves in very specific ways. At the center of the floor lay a circular depression, lined with what appeared to be bronze, though heavily corroded by centuries of dampness. "This depression," Dr. Ashford continued, "seems to have been designed to hold water, most likely given the mineral deposits we found. We believe it may have served as some sort of sympathetic resonator, creating a connection between the bell above and the sea beyond." I knelt beside the bronze-lined pool, studying its construction with growing fascination. The metalwork was clearly contemporary with the bell itself, late 14th century, and had been executed with the same level of craftsmanship that had characterized the lost bell. More intriguing still were the symbols carved into the stone around the pool's circumference, a mixture of Christian imagery and older pre-Christian motifs that spoke of traditions far more ancient than the medieval church. "There's something else," Dr. Ashford said quietly, "something we discovered only yesterday." He led me to the eastern wall of the chamber, where a section of stone had been carefully removed to reveal a hidden recess. Within this recess lay a collection of objects that took my breath away. Fragments of bronze that could only have come from the original bell, along with a leather-wrapped bundle that proved to contain a manuscript written in the same hand I had come to know so well from the parish records. The manuscript, which Dr. Ashford allowed me to examine by lamplight in the chamber itself, proved to be Father Thomas de Grey's personal account of the bell's consecration and first manifestations, written in Latin with occasional passages in the vernacular. It provided a detailed description of the rituals used to bind the bell to its eternal purpose and ensure that its voice would continue to call souls to rest even should its earthly form perish. Most remarkable of all was Father de Grey's description of the chamber itself, which he referred to as the speculum aquarum, the mirror of waters. According to his account, the bronze-lined pool was filled with seawater during the bell's consecration, and this water was ritually connected to all the waters surrounding the parish. Thus, the bell's voice could travel through this sympathetic link to reach souls lost in any part of the surrounding sea. "The implications are extraordinary," Dr. Ashford observed as I finished reading. "If Father de Grey's account is accurate, then the bell's continued manifestation is not supernatural in the sense we usually understand the term, but rather the result of a sophisticated medieval technology that we have only begun to comprehend." That evening, as we sat in Dr. Ashford's study discussing the day's discoveries, I became increasingly convinced that our excavation of the resonance chamber had somehow reactivated dormant aspects of the bell's original consecration. The fragments of bronze we had discovered were not merely archaeological relics, but active components of a system that transcended the normal boundaries between past and present, physical and spiritual, sea and shore. My conviction proved justified shortly before midnight, when both of us became aware of a subtle change in the atmosphere of the rectory. The air seemed to thicken slightly, and sounds from outside became muffled in the characteristic manner I remembered from my previous encounter with the bell's manifestation. Ashford and I exchanged glances, each recognizing in the other's expression the same mixture of apprehension and anticipation that such moments invariably provoked. "It's beginning again," Dr. Ashford said quietly, "but differently this time, more powerfully." We made our way quickly to the church, where the restoration work had left the tower partially scaffolded, and the ancient stones exposed to the night air. The fog was rolling in from the sea with unusual rapidity, but it possessed a luminous quality I had not observed during my previous visit. As it enveloped the village, it seemed to carry with it not merely moisture but some more subtle emanation that made the very air tingle with potential energy. The tolling began as we reached the churchyard, but this time it came not from above or below, but from all around us, as though the entire landscape had become a vast bell, resonating with harmonics that reached deep into the foundations of reality itself. The sound was overwhelming in its richness and complexity, containing within its bronze voice not merely the call to the drowned but echoes of every prayer ever spoken within the ancient walls, every hymn sung by generations of faithful, every tolling for the dead across 4 centuries of continuous worship. As the sound intensified, the fog around us began to take on structure and form. But these were not the vague, shifting shapes I had observed before. Instead, I found myself looking upon a scene of extraordinary clarity and detail, the medieval village of Greymere, as it had existed in Father de Grey's time, complete with harbor ships, and the original church tower rising majestically above streets that had been claimed by the sea centuries ago. Within this ghostly recreation of the past, figures moved with the same purposeful deliberation I remembered from my first encounter with the bell's manifestation. But now I could see them clearly, not as fog shapes but as fully realized individuals, each bearing the marks of their particular fate, yet possessed of a dignity and peace that transcended their tragic circumstances. At the center of the scene stood Father Thomas de Grey himself, recognizable from his written descriptions of his own appearance. He was conducting some form of ritual or ceremony, his hands raised in blessing over a procession of souls that seemed to extend far beyond the visible boundaries of the spectral village. As I watched, he turned toward the place where Dr. Ashford and I stood in our own time, and his eyes met mine across the centuries that separated us. In that moment of contact, I understood the full significance of what the medieval priest had accomplished. He had not merely created a device for guiding souls to rest. He had established a permanent bridge between the world of the living and the realm of the dead, a connection that would endure as long as human beings continued to lose their lives to the sea and require assistance in finding their way to peace. The vision, for lack of a better term, lasted perhaps 20 minutes, during which Dr. Ashford and I stood transfixed in the churchyard, witnessing centuries of maritime tragedy and spiritual resolution compressed into a single extraordinary moment. We saw ships from every era foundering in storms, their crews joining the eternal procession that wound its way through the spectral streets of medieval Greymere, toward whatever final destination awaited them beyond the veil of death. Most moving of all was the sight of recent casualties, men who had died in the Great War, their faces bearing the particular exhaustion of modern warfare, yet finding solace in the ancient ritual that welcomed all souls regardless of the era or manner of their passing. The bell's call, I realized, was truly universal in its reach, offering peace to every soul that had been claimed by the waters around this stretch of coast. As the vision began to fade, Father de Grey approached our position directly, his form becoming more solid and present with each step. When he stood before us, he was as real and substantial as any living person, though a faint luminescence around his edges marked him clearly as belonging to that other realm from which he had temporarily emerged. "You have served the purpose well," he said to Dr. Ashford, his voice carrying the authority of centuries. "The chamber sleeps no longer, and the work continues as it was meant to." Then turning to me, "And you, scholar of distant days, will carry the knowledge forward to those who have eyes to see." Before I could respond, he raised his hand in the same gesture of blessing I had observed during the ritual, and I felt a profound sense of peace settle over me, not the peace of endings, but of continuings, of purposes fulfilled and duties properly discharged. "The bell tolls for all souls," Father de Grey said, his voice already beginning to fade as the vision dissolved around us. "Living and dead, present and past, all who hear its call may find their way to rest." And then he was gone, along with the spectral village and its eternal procession, leaving Dr. Ashford and me standing in the ordinary churchyard of modern Greymere, with nothing but the gradually dispersing fog to mark the extraordinary events we had witnessed. Yet the bronze fragments in the newly discovered chamber continued to resonate faintly, and I knew that the ancient system had been fully reactivated. The bell would continue its work, calling souls to peace across the centuries, its voice carrying over waters that connected all times and all places where human beings had met their fate in the embrace of the sea. I departed Greymere for the final time, the following morning, carrying with me not only the memory of what I had witnessed, but also a small fragment of bronze from the original bell, which Dr. Ashford insisted I accept as a token of our shared experience. The fragment was no larger than a coin, yet it seemed to retain some echo of the great bell's voice, humming almost inaudibly when held to the ear on quiet nights. The train journey back to Cambridge provided ample opportunity for reflection on the extraordinary events of the past few days. I found myself thinking particularly of Father de Grey's final words about carrying knowledge forward to those who have eyes to see. Clearly, I had been entrusted with some form of responsibility, though the exact nature of that responsibility remained unclear. In the months that followed, I began to understand what was expected of me. Letters began arriving from colleagues at other universities, from local historians in coastal parishes, from clergymen who had encountered similar phenomena in their own churches. Word had somehow spread, discreetly, through channels I never fully identified, that I possessed knowledge of certain maritime mysteries that had long puzzled observers of coastal folklore. Each inquiry was carefully worded, revealing just enough to indicate genuine need while avoiding explicit statements that might seem incredible to casual readers. A professor in Edinburgh wrote of acoustic anomalies in a ruined abbey overlooking the Firth of Forth. A vicar in Cornwall mentioned unusual manifestations during winter storms at his clifftop church. A local historian in Wales described traditional practices that seemed to center around a lost church bell and its continuing influence on the community. To each of these correspondents, I provided what assistance I could, sharing insights gleaned from my experiences at Greymere, while being careful never to reveal more than the inquirer was prepared to accept. In several cases, I was able to arrange discreet visits to examine the sites in question, always approaching them with the respect and caution that such places demanded. What I discovered through these investigations was a network of ancient sites stretching along the entire western and northern coasts of Britain. Churches, abbeys, and holy wells where the boundary between worlds had been deliberately thinned by medieval practitioners who understood far more about the nature of death and spiritual transition than our modern age generally acknowledges. The bells of Greymere were not unique, but rather part of a comprehensive system designed to assist souls in their passage from one realm to another. As I write this account in the summer of 1923, 4 years have passed since my first encounter with the Greymere Bell, and I find myself increasingly drawn to questions about the nature of time itself and the persistence of human consciousness beyond physical death. The phenomena I have witnessed and investigated have convinced me that our usual understanding of mortality is profoundly incomplete, and that the medieval church possessed knowledge of spiritual realities that we have largely forgotten. The bronze fragment from the original bell remains in my possession, resting in a place of honor on my study desk, where it serves as a constant reminder of the extraordinary events I have witnessed. On certain nights, particularly when fog rolls in from the sea, even here in Cambridge, many miles from the coast, I fancy I can hear it humming softly, as though responding to some distant call that my earthly ears cannot detect. More significantly, I have begun to experience what I can only describe as moments of enhanced perception, during which the normal boundaries between past and present seem to become permeable. These episodes occur without warning and last only a few seconds, but they provide glimpses of activities and presences that exist alongside our ordinary world, yet remain invisible to normal consciousness. I see figures walking through the college quadrangles who wear the dress of centuries past, hear voices speaking in languages that have been dead for generations, and occasionally catch sight of processions moving through the mists that gather along the river Cam on autumn evenings. I have shared none of these developments with my colleagues at the college, knowing that such confidences would only result in concern for my mental stability and possibly damage to my academic reputation. Instead, I continue to pursue my official research into ecclesiastical history, while maintaining a private correspondence with others who have encountered similar phenomena. This network of discreet observers, bound together by shared experiences that cannot be publicly acknowledged, has become a source of both knowledge and comfort as I continue to explore the mysteries that first drew me to Greymere. The true purpose of this account has become clearer to me as I near its completion. I am writing not merely to record extraordinary events for posterity, but to provide guidance for others who may find themselves drawn into contact with forces and phenomena that transcend ordinary experience. The bell of Greymere continues to toll, not only for the souls of the drowned, but for all who have the sensitivity to hear its call and the courage to respond appropriately. For those who may encounter similar manifestations in other locations, I offer these observations based on my 4 years of investigation. First, approach such phenomena with respect rather than curiosity. The forces involved are ancient, powerful, and dedicated to purposes that transcend individual understanding. They are not mere objects of study, but active participants in spiritual processes that serve the deepest needs of human consciousness. Second, recognize that direct encounter with these forces inevitably changes the observer. Once you have heard the tolling of a drowned bell or witnessed the procession of souls it summons, you will never again be quite the same person you were before. The change is not harmful, but it is profound and permanent. Third, accept the responsibility that comes with such knowledge. Those who witness these phenomena become part of a network of guardians, tasked with preserving and protecting the sites where the boundaries between worlds remain thin. This responsibility may manifest in unexpected ways and at unexpected times, but it is always purposeful and ultimately beneficial. Finally, understand that the phenomena themselves are not supernatural in the sense of being contrary to natural law, but rather representative of natural laws that operate on levels beyond our current scientific understanding. The medieval practitioners who created sites like Greymere possessed genuine knowledge of these deeper principles, knowledge that we may eventually recover through careful investigation and respectful attention to their methods. The bell continues to toll in the fog that rolls in from the North Sea, carrying its ancient message to all who have the wisdom to listen. Its voice speaks not of endings but of continuings, not of separation but of connection across all the boundaries that seem to divide us from one another and from the deeper mysteries of existence. In the years since my first encounter with the Greymere Bell, I have come to understand that we live in a world far more layered and interconnected than our modern rationalism allows us to acknowledge. The dead are not gone, but transformed. The past is not finished, but ongoing, and the boundaries we imagine between different levels of reality are far more permeable than we suppose. I have decided to place this account among my papers with instructions that it should not be published during my lifetime, but may be released to appropriate scholars after my death, if they judge it to be of value. The phenomena described herein continue to manifest themselves at Greymere and other sites along the British coast. and there will undoubtedly be others who encounter them in years to come. Should this narrative prove helpful to such future investigators, then its writing will have served its intended purpose. The bronze fragment from the original bell remains on my desk as I write these final words, and as evening approaches, I fancy I can hear it beginning to hum with that familiar otherworldly resonance. Tonight, as on so many nights since my return from Greymere, I will fall asleep to the sound of distant tolling, not mournful but welcoming, not ending but calling, the voice of the drowned bell carrying its ancient message across the waters that connect all shores and all times. All souls who hear this calling, living and dead alike, may find their way to peace. Found among the papers of Dr. Tobias Whitmore, following his death in March 1924, the bronze fragment mentioned in his account was discovered on his desk, though it appeared to be nothing more than an ordinary piece of corroded metal. The present editor has verified the existence of the churches and locations mentioned in Dr. Whitmore's narrative, though local inquiries about the phenomena he describes have met with the sort of polite evasion that suggests the traditions persist even today. HWM, 1925.